The pastel pink and mint green balloons swayed gently in the afternoon breeze as Sarah cradled 3-week-old Emma against her chest. The baby shower had been Margaret's idea, a proper celebration for the newest addition to the family. She'd insisted. Sarah had wanted something small and intimate, but her mother-in-law had other plans as usual. "Sarah, darling, you look exhausted," Margaret announced loudly enough for the entire backyard gathering to hear. Her voice carried that particular tone Sarah had learned to dread. Syrupy sweet on the surface with razor-sharp edges underneath. "Motherhood is quite the adjustment, isn't it?" Sarah forced a smile, instinctively tightening her hold on Emma. The postpartum anxiety that had been her constant companion since the birth made everything feel overwhelming, and Margaret's scrutiny wasn't helping. "I'm managing fine, thank you." "Of course you are, dear." Margaret's laugh tinkled like broken glass. She moved closer, her perfectly manicured fingers reaching toward the baby. "May I?" Before Sarah could respond, Margaret had already begun lifting Emma from her arms. The baby stirred, her tiny face scrunching in that way newborns do, and Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Oh my," she said loud enough for Sarah's mother, David's aunts and several family friends to hear. "She's quite unique looking, isn't she?" The conversations around them began to quiet. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as she watched Margaret examine her daughter like a specimen under a microscope. "Margaret," Sarah's mother, Linda, said carefully, "she's beautiful." "All babies are." "Well, of course," Margaret interrupted with a dismissive way. "But you have to admit, she's got that unfortunate nose from Sarah's side. And those ears, goodness, they stick out something fierce. Poor little thing." She turned Emma slightly, as if displaying her to the crowd. "David was such a gorgeous baby, perfect features, lovely coloring. This one, well, I suppose we can't all be blessed with good genes." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt as though she'd been slapped. Her hands shook as she reached for Emma, her maternal instincts screaming at her to protect her baby from this woman's venom. "She's 3 weeks old," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage and hurt. "Oh, I'm not criticizing," Margaret said, finally handing Emma back. "I'm just being honest, someone has to be. It's better to have realistic expectations, don't you think? She might grow into her features eventually." Sarah's Aunt Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. David's cousin Amy found sudden interest in her phone. Even the neighbors who'd been invited looked away, embarrassed by the cruelty they'd witnessed. "I think Emma is perfect," Linda said firmly, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Sarah stared down at her daughter's sleeping face, the button nose, the delicate ears, the impossibly long eyelashes. Emma was beautiful, she was perfect. And this woman, this supposed grandmother, had just publicly declared her granddaughter defective. The rest of the shower passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation. Sarah went through the motions of opening gifts and thanking guests, but Margaret's words echoed in her mind like a poisonous mantra. By the time the last guest left, Sarah felt hollowed out, her confidence as a new mother shattered. As she sat in the nursery that evening, feeding Emma in the soft glow of the nightlight, Sarah made a quiet promise to her daughter: no one would ever make her feel small or unwanted again, especially not her own family. The text message arrived 3 days later while Sarah was trying to coax Emma into taking a nap. It was from David's sister Rachel, who lived 2 states away and had missed the shower. "Hey, just wanted to check on you. Mom called and said the baby shower was challenging because Emma is having some developmental concerns. Is everything okay? Should I be worried?" Sarah stared at the phone, her blood turning to ice. Developmental concerns? Emma was 3 weeks old. She was perfectly healthy, the pediatrician had confirmed it at her 2-week checkup. What had Margaret told Rachel? Her fingers trembled as she typed back. "Emma is completely healthy. What exactly did your mother say?" The response came quickly. "She said Emma has some unfortunate features and that you're struggling to bond because of it. She's worried about both of you. I thought maybe postpartum depression." Sarah's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Margaret hadn't just humiliated her publicly, she was spreading lies about Emma's health and Sarah's fitness as a mother behind her back. When David came home from work that evening, Sarah confronted him with the text messages. He read them while loosening his tie, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, you know how Mom can be," he said finally, not meeting her eyes. "She probably just misunderstood something, Or maybe Rachel got the wrong impression, misunderstood what exactly. Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. That she called our daughter unfortunate looking in front of 20 people. That she's now telling your family I can't bond with my own baby. David sank into the couch, running his hands through his hair. Sarah, please. I know she was inappropriate at the shower, but she's not malicious. She's just old-fashioned. She says things without thinking. Old-fashioned? Sarah laughed bitterly. David, she's spreading lies about our daughter's health, about my mental state. This isn't thoughtless, it's calculated. You're being dramatic, David said, but his tone lacked conviction. She loves Emma, she loves you, she's just difficult sometimes. Sarah stared at her husband, really looked at him, and saw what she'd been trying to ignore for months. The way he always made excuses for his mother's behavior, the way he minimized Sarah's concerns, the way he asked her to keep the peace, while Margaret got away with emotional warfare. I need you to call your sister and tell her the truth, Sarah said quietly. I need you to tell her that Emma is healthy and that I'm fine. David shifted uncomfortably. I will, but maybe we should just let this blow over. You know how family drama gets. It'll be forgotten in a few weeks. No, Sarah said firmly. It won't, because this is who your mother is, David. This is what she does. And if you can't see that, then I'm more alone in this than I thought. That night, as David slept beside her, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. She could hear Emma's soft breathing through the baby monitor, and with each gentle sound, her resolve grew stronger. Margaret had declared war on the wrong mother. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, watchful quiet. Sarah began paying attention in ways she never had before. Not just to what Margaret said, but to how she said it, when she said it and who was listening. She started keeping a small notebook, documenting each interaction with clinical precision. September 15th, Margaret visited unannounced, asked if Emma was developing normally because she seems small for her age. Suggested I might not be feeding her enough. Made comment about my inexperience in front of neighbor Mrs. Chen. September 18th, family dinner. Margaret told story about David's perfect baby pictures, then looked meaningfully at Emma and sighed. Asked David privately if he was disappointed about Emma's appearance, overheard from kitchen. The notebook filled quickly. Sarah realized she'd been living in a fog of gaslighting for months, dismissing incident after incident as just Margaret being Margaret. But written down in black and white, the pattern was undeniable. More importantly, she wasn't the only victim. At David's cousin Amy's birthday party, Sarah quietly approached Jennifer, David's other sister-in-law who had married into the family 5 years earlier. Can I ask you something? Sarah said carefully, watching Jennifer's 2-year-old play with blocks. How did Margaret react when Sophia was born? Jennifer's expression immediately shifted, becoming guarded. Why do you ask? Just curious about her as a grandmother. Jennifer glanced around to make sure Margaret wasn't nearby, then leaned closer. She told everyone at the hospital that Sophia looked nothing like the family. Said she hoped she'd grow into her features because she was unfortunate looking. Sound familiar? Sarah's heart pounded. She said almost exactly the same thing about Emma. She's done it to every baby in this family except David, Jennifer whispered. My friend Lisa warned me before I married Tom, but I didn't believe her. Margaret has a pattern. That evening, Sarah's 8-year-old stepson Jake climbed into her lap while she was feeding Emma. Jake was David's son from his first marriage, and he'd been coming to stay with them every other weekend for the past year. Sarah, he said, his voice small. Why does Grandma Margaret say mean things about Emma? Sarah's hand stilled on the baby's back. What do you mean, sweetie? She told Uncle Tom that Emma looks weird, and that maybe there's something wrong with her brain because she doesn't smile enough. But Emma's just a baby. Babies don't smile much, right? The notebook entry that night was longer than usual. Sarah was beginning to understand that Margaret's cruelty wasn't random. It was strategic, designed to undermine confidence and create doubt. And now she was doing it in front of Jake, potentially damaging his relationship with his baby sister. Over the following weeks, Jake became an unexpected source of information. Children, Sarah realized, heard everything adults thought they missed. During their quiet moments together, he would casually mention things. Grandma Margaret told Grandpa that you cry a lot because you're sad about Emma, he said one afternoon while coloring. But I don't think you're sad about Emma, you smile when you hold her. Another time, Grandma Margaret showed me pictures of when Daddy was a baby. She said he was much prettier than Emma. I think Emma's pretty too though. Sarah began to see the psychological warfare with new clarity. Margaret wasn't just being thoughtlessly cruel, she was systematically attempting to damage the family's perception of Emma and Sarah's capabilities as a mother. Every comment was calculated to plant seeds of doubt. But Jake also shared other stories, ones that made Sarah's pulse quicken with possibility. Grandma Margaret has a box of old pictures she doesn't like people to see, he mentioned casually one evening. She got really mad when I found them in her closet. They're of some lady who looks like her, but younger. What did the lady look like? Sarah asked carefully. Jake scrunched up his face, thinking, kind of sad, and she was holding a baby, but Grandma Margaret said it wasn't family. She said the lady made bad choices, and that's why she looked so sad. Sarah's mind began to race. There were pieces of a puzzle here, fragments of Margaret's past that she'd never heard David mention. That weekend she began her own quiet investigation, starting with David's father, Harold. Harold had always been kind to Sarah, often seeming embarrassed by his wife's behavior. When she asked him about family history over coffee, he seemed almost relieved to have someone to talk to. Margaret had a difficult childhood, he said carefully. Her own mother was critical, very focused on appearances, family reputation. Margaret never talks about those years. Were there any other children in her family? Sarah asked. Harold's expression grew sad. She had an older sister who died young. Car accident, but before that, he paused, seeming to weigh his words. There were family troubles. Margaret's mother was very harsh about mistakes, especially ones that affected the family's standing in the community. Sarah nodded, filing away every detail. She was beginning to understand that Margaret's cruelty might have roots in her own pain, but that didn't excuse it, and it certainly didn't mean Sarah had to accept it. By the end of the month, Sarah had transformed from a confused, hurt new mother into someone with a plan. She wasn't looking for revenge, she was looking for truth, and she had a feeling that when the truth came out, it would be more powerful than any retaliation she could devise. October brought cooler weather and Margaret's increasingly bold attack. It was as if she sensed Sarah's growing confidence and decided to escalate her campaign before losing her advantage. The first major incident happened at Emma's 2-month pediatric appointment. Sarah had mentioned the visit to David in passing, not thinking much of it, but when she arrived at the doctor's office, she found Margaret already there, sitting in the waiting room with a concerned expression. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so glad I caught you," Margaret said loudly, drawing the attention of other parents. "I've been so worried about Emma's development. She seems delayed compared to other babies her age." Dr. Martinez, who had been Emma's pediatrician since birth, looked confused. "I'm sorry, are you the grandmother?" Margaret said firmly. "And I have some concerns I'd like to discuss with you privately." Sarah felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks, but this time it was accompanied by something else, cold, calculated anger. "Margaret, Emma is perfectly healthy. Dr. Martinez has confirmed this at every visit." "Well, of course you'd say that, dear," Margaret replied with that syrupy tone. "But sometimes mothers can't see what's right in front of them, especially first-time mothers." The appointment became a nightmare. Margaret peppered Dr. Martinez with questions about Emma's reflexes, her feeding schedule, her sleep patterns. She suggested that Sarah might be missing signs of developmental delays, and wondered aloud if postpartum depression was affecting Sarah's judgment. Martinez, to his credit, remained professional, while firmly stating that Emma was developing beautifully and that Sarah was an excellent mother. But the damage was done. Other parents in the waiting room had heard everything. Sarah left feeling like she'd been publicly branded as an incompetent mother. That evening, she confronted David again. This time with witnesses, she'd asked her mother and sister to come for dinner. "Your mother ambushed me at the doctor's office today," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her rage. "She tried to convince Emma's pediatrician that I'm neglecting our daughter's development." David's face went pale. She suggested I have postpartum depression and that I'm missing signs of Emma's delays." In front of a waiting room full of people, Linda, Sarah's mother, set down her fork with a sharp clink. "That woman crossed a line months ago, David. This isn't about being old-fashioned or difficult. This is about a grown woman trying to destroy her own daughter-in-law's confidence." "Mom's just concerned," David said weakly. But even he seemed shaken. Sarah's sister Beth laughed bitterly. "Concerned? David, She's literally harassing Sarah and spreading lies about Emma's health. What's it going to take for you to see this? The conversation that followed was tense and uncomfortable. David's relatives, who had been invited to create a buffer, sat in awkward silence as Sarah's family laid out the pattern of abuse they'd witnessed. But by the end of the evening, something had shifted. David looked genuinely disturbed, and his Aunt Carol admitted that she'd been uncomfortable with Margaret's behavior for years. She did the same thing to my daughter-in-law, Carol said quietly, said terrible things about the baby's appearance, questioned whether she was feeding him enough. We all just let it slide. The next escalation came 2 weeks later at Jake's school play. Margaret had insisted on coming, and Sarah had agreed, thinking a public setting would keep her behavior in check. She was wrong. During intermission, Margaret cornered Sarah in the hallway, her voice carrying clearly to other parents nearby. I've been thinking about Emma's future, she said, her tone dripping with false concern. Given her challenges, have you considered what kind of opportunities she'll have? I mean, with her looks and her delayed development, she might struggle socially. Perhaps you should start preparing for that reality. Sarah stared at her mother-in-law, understanding finally that this woman would never stop. Margaret wasn't just being cruel, she was trying to systematically destroy Emma's future before it even began. Emma is 2 months old, Sarah said quietly. She's a healthy, beautiful baby. Oh, darling, Margaret sighed dramatically. Denial won't help her. Sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is be realistic about her child's limitations. Jake, who had been looking for them after the play ended, appeared at Sarah's elbow. He'd heard everything, and his 8-year-old face showed confusion and hurt. Grandma Margaret, he said in his clear, innocent voice, why do you always say mean things about Emma? She's just a baby. Margaret's expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered. I'm not being mean, sweetheart. I'm being honest. Sometimes adults have to discuss difficult things. But Emma's not difficult, Jake said, his voice getting stronger. She's perfect, and Sarah takes really good care of her. Why do you tell people she doesn't? Other parents had stopped to listen, drawn by the tension in the conversation. Sarah saw recognition in some of their faces. They'd witnessed similar scenes before. Jake, honey, Margaret said, her voice taking on a warning tone. Children don't understand these things. I understand that you're being mean, Jake said stubbornly, and I understand that you made Sarah cry. My mom used to cry when people said mean things about me too. The reference to David's first wife, who had died in a car accident when Jake was 4, hit like a physical blow. Margaret's face went white, and Sarah suddenly understood something crucial. Jake had been Margaret's victim too, in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. That night, after Jake had fallen asleep, Sarah sat in Emma's nursery and made a decision. Margaret's behavior was no longer just about her, it was affecting Jake's sense of family, his relationship with his baby sister, and his understanding of how people should treat each other. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the family photos from the past few months, looking for something specific. There, in the background of a Labor Day barbecue photo, she spotted it, Margaret's purse, sitting open on a chair, with what looked like old photographs visible inside. Jake's innocent comments about the hidden pictures suddenly took on new significance. Margaret was carrying pieces of her past with her, and Sarah had a feeling those pieces held the key to understanding and stopping her reign of terror. The next family gathering was David's birthday dinner in 2 weeks. Sarah began planning, not for revenge, but for revelation. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against a bully was simply the truth. David's birthday dinner was held at Margaret and Harold's house, a sprawling colonial that had always intimidated Sarah with its pristine perfection. The entire family was there. David's siblings Tom and Rachel with their spouses, various aunts, uncles, and cousins, plus Sarah's mother Linda, who had become something of a protective presence at family gatherings. Sarah arrived with Emma in her carrier and Jake bouncing excitedly beside her. At nearly 3 months old, Emma was becoming more alert, her eyes tracking movement and her tiny mouth forming what looked like the beginnings of smiles. She was, by any objective measure, a beautiful, healthy baby. The evening started peacefully enough. Margaret played the perfect hostess, complimenting everyone's appearance and fussing over the dinner preparations. But Sarah noticed the way her mother-in-law's eyes kept drifting to Emma with that familiar expression of distaste. The first blow came during dinner when Emma began to fuss slightly in her carrier. "Oh my," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the table. She's quite the difficult baby, isn't she? I've never seen a child who cries so much. She's not crying, Sarah said calmly, lifting Emma to soothe her. She's just hungry. Hungry again. Margaret's eyebrows rose dramatically. Goodness, Sarah, you just fed her an hour ago. Are you sure your milk is sufficient? Some women simply can't produce enough quality nutrition for their babies. The table fell silent. Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time she was prepared for it. She'd been documenting these moments for weeks, and she wasn't going to let Margaret gaslight her again. Emma's pediatrician says she's thriving, Sarah said evenly. Her weight gain is exactly where it should be. Well, pediatricians can be overly optimistic, Margaret replied with a dismissive wave. Sometimes they don't want to worry new mothers unnecessarily. Jake, who had been quietly eating his mashed potatoes, looked up with confusion. But Grandma Margaret, Emma's getting bigger every time I see her, and she smiles at me now. Look. He made a funny face at Emma, who responded with what was unmistakably a smile. The family members around the table couldn't help but smile back. It was a genuinely sweet moment. Margaret's expression soured. That's just gas, sweetheart. Babies that young don't really smile. Yes, they do, Jake said with the confidence of an 8-year-old who knew he was right. Sarah showed me in her baby book. Emma's doing everything she's supposed to do. Jake, honey, Margaret's voice took on that warning tone Sarah had learned to recognize. You shouldn't contradict adults, but Jake was not deterred. Something about his grandmother's tone seemed to flip a switch in him, and he turned to look at her with the direct, unfiltered honesty that only children possess. Why are you always so mean about Emma? He asked, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet dining room. You never say nice things about her like you do about other babies. Margaret's face went rigid. I'm not being mean, Jacob. I'm being realistic. But that's what you said about my mom too, Jake said, his voice getting stronger. You used to say she wasn't pretty enough for Daddy, and that she didn't take good care of me. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went white. Several family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jake, Margaret said sharply. But Jake was on a roll now. The floodgates of childhood honesty fully opened. And you showed me those pictures in your room, the ones you said were of a lady who made bad choices. But she looked just like you, Grandma Margaret. She was holding a baby, and she looked really sad. Margaret's face drained of all color. Jacob, stop talking. You said the lady was stupid for having a baby when she was too young, and that her family was ashamed of her. You said that's why she looked so sad in the pictures. But why do you keep pictures of someone you don't like? The room had gone so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She watched as Margaret's carefully constructed facade began to crumble before everyone's eyes. Jake, Sarah said gently. What else did Grandma Margaret tell you about those pictures? Margaret shot her a look of pure venom. Sarah, don't encourage this. But Jake was looking at Sarah with trust and love, and he continued in his innocent, matter-of-fact way. She said the lady's baby was ugly, and that nobody wanted it. She said that's what happens when people make bad choices. They get stuck with things they don't want. Harold, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Margaret, what pictures is he talking about? Margaret's hands were shaking now. It's nothing, Harold. Just some old family photos. The ones of your sister? Harold asked carefully. No, Margaret snapped, then seemed to realize her mistake. I mean, they're not important. But Jake, with the devastating honesty of childhood, delivered the final blow. She said the lady in the pictures was her, Grandma Margaret. She said she had a baby when she was 16, and that her mommy and daddy said terrible things about the baby and about her. She said that's why she had to give the baby away. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret sat frozen, her face a mask of horror and shame. She said, Jake continued, oblivious to the bombshell he was dropping, that her mommy called her baby ugly, and said it would never amount to anything. She said that's why she knows when babies are going to have problems, because she learned the hard way. Margaret's carefully constructed world came crashing down in that moment. The woman who had spent months tearing down Sarah's confidence, who had publicly humiliated her and spread lies about Emma's health, was revealed to be someone who had lived through the exact same cruelty herself. Is that true? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. You don't know what it was like, the shame, the whispers, the way people looked at me. My own mother said I was a disgrace, that my baby was. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could take back the words. But it was too late. The truth was out, spoken in the innocent voice of an 8-year-old who had simply been repeating what his grandmother had told him in what she thought was confidence. Sarah looked around the table at the shocked faces of David's family, then down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. The cycle of cruelty that had started with Margaret's own shame and trauma had been perpetuated for decades, passed down like a poisonous inheritance. But it was going to stop here, tonight, with Emma. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Sarah said quietly, and she meant, "No one should have to go through that, but that doesn't give you the right to do the same thing to Emma, or to me." Margaret's face crumpled, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, she looked fragile and broken, rather than powerful and cruel. The truth, as Sarah had suspected, was indeed more powerful than any revenge she could have planned. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by Margaret's quiet sobs and the gentle sounds of Emma, stirring in Sarah's arms. No one seemed to know what to say. How do you respond when a family's carefully maintained facade crumbles in front of your eyes? Harold was the first to speak, his voice heavy with decades of unspoken understanding. "Margaret, why didn't you ever tell me about the baby?" Margaret's shoulders shook. "Because I was because I thought if I never talked about it, if I never let myself be vulnerable like that again, I could forget, I could be better." "But you weren't better," Rachel said quietly, her voice filled with recognition. "You were just passing it on." The realization seemed to hit different family members at different moments. Tom looked stricken as he glanced at his wife Jennifer, clearly remembering how his mother had treated their daughter Sophia. David's aunt, Carol, was nodding slowly, pieces of old family dynamics finally making sense. "My God," David whispered, looking at his mother with new eyes. "All these years you've been doing to other people what was done to you." Margaret's tears came harder now. "I didn't mean to. I thought I was protecting the family. I thought I was being realistic, preparing everyone for disappointment. But you weren't protecting anyone," Sarah said gently, her voice surprisingly steady. "You were just afraid that if you admitted Emma was beautiful, if you let yourself love her the way grandmothers should, you'd have to face the fact that your own baby deserved that same love." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She doubled over, sobbing openly now in a way that seemed to release years of suppressed grief. Jake, who had been watching this adult drama unfold with the wide-eyed confusion of childhood, slipped from his chair and walked over to his grandmother. With the simple compassion that children possess, he put his small hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Grandma Margaret," he said softly. "Everybody makes mistakes, but you don't have to keep making the same one." The wisdom in those words, spoken by an 8-year-old who had just unknowingly exposed decades of family trauma, broke something open in the room. Margaret looked up at Jake through her tears, then at Emma sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, and for the first time her expression held no judgment, no cruelty, just raw, painful honesty. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Emma is beautiful, and I'm so sorry." The days that followed were complicated and sometimes painful. Margaret didn't immediately transform into the loving grandmother Sarah had once hoped for. Trauma and shame run too deep for overnight miracles. But she began therapy, something Harold had apparently been suggesting for years. David, for his part, was devastated by the revelation. He'd spent his entire life thinking his mother was simply difficult, never understanding that her behavior stemmed from her own unhealed wounds. He threw himself into supporting Sarah and making amends for years of minimizing her concern. "I should have protected you," he said one evening as they sat together watching Emma sleep. "I should have seen what was happening." "You were protecting your mother," Sarah replied. "You were trying to keep your family together, but now we know the truth, and we can do better." The family dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Jennifer, who had been Margaret's victim 5 years earlier, reached out to Sarah with a mixture of relief and vindication. "I knew I wasn't crazy," she said over coffee. "I knew it wasn't just me being sensitive." Rachel, calling from 2 states away, apologized for believing Margaret's lies about Emma's health. "I should have questioned it more," she said. "I should have known Mom was projecting her own issues." But perhaps the most significant change was in Jake. Having been the catalyst for his grandmother's revelation, he seemed to grow in confidence and emotional intelligence. He began asking more questions about family dynamics, about how people should treat each other, about the difference between honesty and cruelty. Sarah, he said one afternoon while helping her feed Emma, do you think Grandma Margaret's baby was as pretty as Emma? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think all babies are beautiful, Jake, but I think Grandma Margaret's baby was probably beautiful in his or her own way, just like Emma is beautiful in hers. Do you think he knows that now? The baby who got adopted. The question made Sarah's heart ache. Somewhere out there was a person, now in their 40s, who had been Margaret's first child, given away in shame and secrecy. Did they know they had siblings? Did they know their birth mother was still alive? I don't know, Sarah said honestly, but I hope someday they do. Margaret's therapy sessions were slow going, but gradually she began to open up about her past. She'd been 17 when she got pregnant, not 16 as Jake had remembered. Her parents had hidden her away for the final months of her pregnancy, then arranged for a closed adoption immediately after birth. She'd never even held her baby. I convinced myself it was for the best, she told Sarah during one of their carefully supervised visits. I told myself that baby deserved better than what I could give, but really, I was just repeating what my parents told me, that I was a disappointment, that my baby was unwanted. These conversations were difficult for Sarah. Part of her wanted to maintain her anger, to keep Margaret at arm's length, as punishment for the months of cruelty, but watching her mother-in-law slowly confront her own trauma, Sarah began to understand that healing for all of them required something more complex than simple just. I need you to understand something, Sarah said during one of these talks. What happened to you was terrible. No one should have to go through that, but Emma deserves a grandmother who loves her unconditionally, and I deserve a mother-in-law who supports me instead of tearing me down. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, I'm trying to learn how to do that. I'm trying to unlearn 40 years of protecting myself by hurting others. The real test came at Emma's first Christmas. Margaret had asked tentatively if she could give Emma a gift, and after much discussion, Sarah had agreed. When Christmas morning arrived, Margaret presented Emma with a small photo album filled with pictures of David as a baby, but also with pictures of Margaret herself as a young mother. I want her to know where she comes from, Margaret said quietly, the good parts and the difficult parts. I want her to know that she's part of a family that's learning to do better. The album's final page contained a letter addressed to Emma to be read when she was old. In it, Margaret apologized for the way she'd treated Emma in her earliest months, explained about the cycle of hurt that had influenced her behavior, and made a promise to spend the rest of her life making amends. As Sarah sat in the same nursery where she'd once made a promise to protect Emma from family cruelty, she realized that promise had evolved. She wasn't just protecting Emma from harm, she was helping to heal a family that had been broken for generations. Emma, now 6 months old and sitting up with support, smiled at her grandmother with the unconditional love that babies possess, and Margaret, for the first time in decades, smiled back without reservation or judgment. The cycle was finally broken. Jake, now 9 and wise beyond his years, summed it up perfectly one evening, as they all sat together in the living room. You know what I think? He said, looking around at his complicated, imperfect, healing family. I think the best thing about the truth is that once you say it out loud, you can finally start fixing what's broken. Sarah looked at her husband, who was finally learning to stand up for his family. She looked at Margaret, who was slowly learning to love without condition. She looked at Jake, who had unknowingly saved them all with his innocent honesty. And she looked at Emma, who would grow up knowing she was loved, valued, and protected. The truth, as Sarah had learned, wasn't just more powerful than revenge, it was more healing than silence, more freeing than secrets, and more transformative than any punishment could ever be. Sometimes the best way to protect the people you love isn't to fight their battles for them, but to give them the tools and the truth they need to heal themselves.